So folks, thank you everyone for joining. We have a naming protocol challenge. You'll see multiple Ramuna Roys there. So I'm going to request you all to rename to your actual names. So by clicking on participants at the bottom, you will see all on the right side, you'll see all the names show up. There'll be one which has me, which is you. Right click that and you can see rename and you'll be able to rename yourself. You can pick whatever identity you'd like. We'll give it another minute and we will get started. And I will probably mention that one more time as people join in. This is every time Zoom teaches you something new on technology, I must say, I'm impressed. Okay. Okay, we will get started in a minute and I'll make one quick announcement. Welcome, good afternoon, everybody. If you're dialing in from India, or good morning, good evening, whichever time zones you're in. I'm going to request you, we've got one technical glitch as we started, that we have a lot of you coming in under one of my colleagues' names. So I'm going to request you to click on participants. You will see the list of participants on the right show up. You will have one which has the word me next to it that indicates you. You'll need to right click that and rename yourself to how you want to be called. With that, I'm going to get started in the interest of time. Welcome everyone to the Difficult Conversations Making Them Easier session. This is our second in our virtual learning web series. And we've got an interactive action-packed session where we'll be using multiple features, we'll have a poll, we'll be having a video and even some conversation. So I'm going to kick that off with just giving you a little bit of context or maybe a question. So the first question I've actually got is right into the topic. What is a difficult conversation? So I'm going to call on a couple of people to just random from the participant list. So I'm just going to request a couple of names there. So maybe I will ask Ramesh, you're one of the early birds in the session. So from your perspective, what is a difficult conversation?
Mr. Vinay, my perspective, a difficult conversation is one where I assess that whatever I'm going to communicate, the recipient is going to find it very tough to understand it or very tough to hear about it. So it could be something, example, I would say that somebody is to be laid off. So that's a conversation which is a difficult conversation, which that's my perception.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ramesh. Tanya, from your perspective. You might be on mute. Yeah, there you are.
Yes. So when every time in my experience, conversations become difficult because certain emotions just came into the picture, and just a random regular conversation turned difficult, right? So I feel that for me, it's about how I manifest some of those emotions so that the conversation does not turn difficult, right? So to me, it's more to do with that. If any situation, actually.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I've got one Ramuna who's put a confrontation or a messaging that you know is not going to be taken up positively by the recipient. Okay, so I'll ask one more person. Umesh, your perspective. What is a difficult conversation for you? Umesh, you're on mute. Nope, I can't hear you. I know you're trying to figure out how to unmute. No? Okay, so maybe I'll ask somebody else. Surabhi, from your perspective, what is a difficult conversation? Surabhi, you're also on mute. Okay, folks, I am going to request you to go on mute unless your name is called. Okay, sorry. Somebody's. I am going to mute all, yeah, if you don't mind. Folks, can you put yourself on mute? Thank you. Okay, so maybe I'll ask Sakina. I can see you there. Maybe could you go off mute and just share from your perspective what is a difficult conversation?
Any situation where it's really awkward. It's usually breaking bad news or yeah, a very awkward situation where emotions, etc., can come into play. So how are we going to work around it so that it doesn't get to something ugly?
Right, great. Thank you. Okay, so let me just share with you our perspective. So the definition is, I think all of you have hit the nail on the head. It's, difficult conversation is anything you find it hard to talk about, right? Our concept of difficult conversations is based on the book, Difficult Conversations. I was trained by Bruce Patten, one of the co-authors of the book. And we brought this to India in partnership with a company called Vantage Partners, which is a spin-off of the Harvard Negotiation Project. We also do a lot of work in the negotiation space. And in this book, which is a really great book, it was actually the first book ever written around conversations and the effectiveness of, or the importance of these conversations. A difficult conversation is anything you find it hard to talk about. It is either a topic or a relationship. It's either about a topic. So I think, Ramesh, you talked about layoffs. I would hope that most people find that conversation difficult. I would be very worried if someone said, oh, I find laying off people very, very easy, right? I hope it's a topic that is uncomfortable. Or it's about a relationship. It could be because of the interpersonal dynamics between two people, or sometimes both. And the concept of difficult conversation exists in both personal life as well as business life. For any of you with kids, we all have that very awkward conversation we have once with our kids about the birds and the bees, right? Or having certain things. And I think it's more awkward for the parents than very often than the kids, and it becomes one as we start talking to them. But in the context of today's session, we're going to be taking a look at what do we do when it comes to the difficult conversations in the context of work. So if that makes sense. So before I do that, I'll just make one more quick announcement. I see a lot of people coming in still as Ramuna Rai, which is my colleague, and we have no idea what has happened technically. So I'm going to request you to click on participants. You'll see the list of everyone. You'll see one listed as me, and that's you. If you can click on that and rename yourself to your actual name, that will be great. I don't know if my colleague Ramuna is actually on this call, but she's managed to clone herself very well, for sure. But that's something that I'd request you to do. Okay, so if that is difficult conversations, I'm going to get you to kind of have a quick thing. Now, the challenge with difficult conversations is something what we call the cycle of indecision. And I think all of us have been through this. We go with, I should raise this. It's going to go badly. It won't help. We all have this, oh boy, yeah, maybe I'll postpone it to the next week. I'll do it next week. I'll do it next week. So we might, and it won't help. So we might say, it's not worth it. I won't raise it. But we all know that I should raise this. So the challenge for many of us is we go through this cycle of indecision of when do we do it. Timing matters, right? And this is a very, very critical element. Now, there's one other aspect of difficult conversation that I didn't talk about. Who is it difficult for? Is it difficult for you, or is it difficult to the other person receiving it? And I don't know if any of you have ever had this experience where you thought it was going to be difficult and your anxiety levels went up. But when you actually had the courage to have that conversation, it went fine because the other person was able to take it or have a very mature conversation. And your anxiousness was about how they would react and what they would possibly do. So the word difficult is in the eye of the beholder. It could be in the person giving it or the person receiving it, or in both. And the other aspect is difficult is subjective. What may be difficult for Shyam on this call may be very easy for Ramesh, and what might be very easy for Ramesh might be what's difficult for Ramesh might be very easy for me or somebody else, Surabhi, for example. So we each have our own demons when it comes to what is difficult conversation. To get into this business context, and I talked about, we are going to be focusing on this from the concept of business. So what I'd like to do is we're going to do a quick breakout activity where the instruction is going to be very simple. I'm going to go back here. My colleague Jijit is on the call. He's going to create maybe about 7 breakout rooms. Let's make it 8 breakout rooms, Jijit. And you're going to have a very fast 7-minute conversation. Appoint a spokesperson very quickly and just share, brainstorm. What kinds of conversations do you consider as difficult and why? And whoever is your spokesperson, when you're back in the main room, you'll need to put that into the chat. Okay, instructions are pretty straightforward. So Jijit, you want to initiate the breakout rooms? It's random, and it'll be fun if I get a breakout room filled with Ramunas. So go, click on join, and you're there. Hi, somebody just joined. Some of you are still in the main room. You should have a breakout room that has popped up for you. If you could, Jijit, want to create a couple more?
Yeah,
Or allot them automatically. Shalil, if you could also go to the breakout room and get folks to rename themselves, that would be awesome. Hi, Mukesh. We're going to put you into a breakout room. Rajesh as well. Hi, Ritu. Good afternoon. Everyone is in a breakout room. They'll be back in a few minutes. If you can hang in there. And for those of you who are listed as Ramona, can I request you to go to participants? You'll see, you'll have to rename yourself. We have a small technical glitch. You'll see one of the names listed as me, that's you. You can click that, you can rename yourself. For those of you who are just joining, we're doing a breakout activity. People should be back in a few minutes. And if you're in here, you will need to rename yourself. Hi, for those of you who just joined, you'll need to rename yourself, please. We're in the midst of a breakout activity. Quite a few participants are in other rooms. Okay, Jijat, you want to give them a 1-minute broadcast and get them back in the room? Jijat?
Yeah, Vinay, doing that.
You want to just end the... Hi, Asta. Hi, Sagar, Sendil. Welcome. People are in a breakout room activity, so they'll be back in a minute.
Hi, good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon. Okay, do you want to end it? Let's
Yeah,
get
Vinay.
everybody back.
Yeah.
We're ending the breakout room. We'll get everybody back here for those of you who are still here. People are coming back. As you come back, if you want to put it into chat, your conversation or any discussion you may have had as to what kinds of conversations do you consider as difficult? Please go ahead. Take a couple of minutes for that. Sujit, have you ended all the breakout rooms?
Yes, I did, Vinay.
Great, thank you. Okay, folks, as you're coming back in the chat, if you can put what kinds of conversations do you find as difficult, that would be great. So let's see what we see. Someone says appraisal conversations, okay. Annual performance compensation, vendor conversations, yep. Giving negative feedback, upward feedback, payment to vendors. Getting to non-collaborative teams, client conversations. Oh, nice list from ethical violations to Saurabh's got a nice long list. Layoffs, divestitures, breaking the news about violations, careless mistakes. Excellent. 3 situations found in group 8, having conversations with self while taking a decision, moral related conversations, and feedback to senior management, and giving feedback to non-performers. Excellent. So we've got lots of those conversations, and none of you knew that difficult conversations was one of the skills required in your job descriptions, right? We don't hire people based on the ability to have difficult conversation. But it is a reality what we need to do. And how can we become effective at it? Thank you. There's more and more coming in. Excellent. So I'll use some of those as examples. So the idea I shared earlier is about the cycle of indecision that you're looking at. How can we break the cycle of indecision and have a productive conversation? So that's what we're going to be exploring. So there's 2 options that we have. We have only 2 options when it comes to these conversations. Either take no action, we avoid it. We hope that the situation goes away. For example, appraisal issues or performance issues, we hope that person gets enough feedback from other places and finds out, and then they move on. Or we take ineffective actions. We do it very poorly. We don't have a very good conversation, and it more often confuses the person than anything else. Could be even feedback upwards. And we know that both choices are costly. So let me just check in with you guys as to, let's do a quick poll as to which of these 2 do you feel is more expensive, is more costly. So let's just launch the poll. Joseph, do you want to launch the poll?
Do you have the option there, Vinay? Because I don't have it.
Okay, let me just launch it. Okay, here goes. It's one or the other. Pick which one do you think is more costly from your perspective? Taking no action or having a conversation and going badly? Oh, we've got about 50 votes in. There's 70 people in here. Let's keep them coming. Couple more. Okay, just a couple more votes and we're good to go. Let me just see which side you sit on. Okay, so if you take a look at this, the results that you see, 58% of you actually said that not having that difficult conversation is worse than having it going badly. Well, so studies have shown that avoiding a difficult conversation has longer term impact than the second option, because if it has gone badly, you can try and get that badly part fixed, but at least you've got the issue out there. So most of us agree that having it. Now, the challenge for many of us is how to have that conversation. The reality is a study by Communication Effectiveness Survey said that from an employee perspective, and I know many of you brought up difficult conversations from a stakeholder or external or a market perspective. What employees want is actually more relevant communication, preferably face-to-face or in video, as we are now in. A lot more two-way and engaging communication, more recognition, more feedback, coaching, and development. All the stuff that we talk about as well. So people want to have conversations. Difficult maybe in our minds. So let's get going into it. So one of the challenges for having a difficult conversation is what we call managing our own internal voice. And what do I mean by that? It's going to go badly, oh my God, I've got to talk to my boss. This might impact me. So the internal voice, we can either bury it or we can dump it. The challenge with the internal voice is if you bury it, it just becomes toxic waste. So for example, you've got to give some feedback to your supervisor if something that's not working well. The longer you wait to have that conversation, the longer the issue will fester. And eventually it pollutes your behavior. It leaks. It shows up in some way or form. You playing avoidance strategy, for example. It could be with a customer. You want to tell a customer that this deal is just not worth it for you anymore, and you keep putting it off. You keep taking on more work, and then eventually you're trying to figure out what your service to that customer might erode over a period of time. So the point is, it actually leads to counterproductive purposes. So how do we bring that internal voice of our fears? So the reality is, I think most of you will agree with this, what you think and feel does drive what you say and do. Agree? It does. Very simple. And this definitely impacts how other people think and feel and drives what they say and do. And in essence, leads to certain results. So the way we break that cycle is working on the first part. What we think and feel and what we drives what we say and do. That's the only thing that we can control, and how we are able to manage our part of the conversation. So here's an example. Imagine these are two peers having a conversation. One peer says, I'm not sure if you understand the magnitude of the problem. Yes, I do, and this is the best solution. What he's actually thinking is so arrogant, she just doesn't get it. And what she's probably thinking is totally useless, what a waste of time, right? And it'll show up in body language. It'll show up in so many ways that we communicate. Now, what are we saying we do? Should we bring it the other way around? Should we say, so arrogant, what does she think of herself? And she's thinking totally useless, what a waste of time. Should he say, you're arrogant and will never get it? And she say, you're useless and wasting my time. I think this is not going to be a difficult conversation. This is going to be a terrible conversation if they actually say. So the whole concept of difficult conversation is, we are not saying stop having bad thoughts. There will be anxiety when we are talking to that supervisor, to that peer, to that employee, to whoever we are talking to. We will have anxiety. Oh my God, I'm not sure he's going to get it. My boss just doesn't listen to my ideas. We're going to have those. It's unrealistic to say, forget those thoughts. We're not saying share everything you're thinking. Don't walk in and say, boss, I want to share some feedback with you, and my perception is you're not going to get it. And because you really generally never listen to my ideas anyway, let me share any of my ideas. That's probably going to be a career limiting move, right? So we're not saying share your thinking. We are not saying give up your perspective and agree with them. What we are saying is insert a step of reflecting and negotiating with yourself. So when there is an internal voice and going to say and do, you might want to step back to what we call shifting our thinking, right? And that is what we are going to be spending a little bit of time on. How do we shift our thinking? Okay. The first thing is, hold your view as a hypothesis that needs to be tested, that it's not completely true. So we're going to do a quick, fun little activity. So I'm going to share a slide here in a minute. I'll give you 60 seconds to read it. And I want you to count the number of letters F, F for fox, F for food, the number of letters F on the slide. Go ahead. There's the slide. And when you have the number, please type it up in chat. Don't spend too much time. Okay, Ramesh says 9, Jay says 13, Subhashini says 12, 11, 14, 12, 13. It's funny, all of you are reading the same slide, but I'm getting very, very different numbers. Sham says 16. 16. Okay, Ravi said 16, 14, 17. Okay, I got 15, I got 9. Okay. 50. Someone changed their answer as well, Jay. Thank you. Okay, so what if I were to tell you that the correct answer is here? If you count as we go along. There's actually 16. So for those of you who got 16, give yourself a pat on the back. Those of you who've got a different number, you've got a couple of options. If you're wearing glasses, get them checked again. If you're not, get them checked. Or we miss data. Just recognize that we sort of miss data. So one question I've got, what if I told you that there's actually over 35? There's 35 there. That from my perspective, there's 35 Fs in that on that slide. How many of you think I would be crazy? And
Might
you can
be
say,
true if we're counting E's also. Which
thank you. Absolutely. Well, if I told you that every E has an F, there's actually 35 of them. Right? So the point again we make is none of us has sole possession of the truth. For those of you who said 9, 13, 14, 15, whatever number you put in, even 16, you're getting a different perspective. So just I'll let that sink in for a minute, because when you're going into a difficult conversation, if you're going in saying, I know what I'm going to say and this is the way it's going to go, you are going to put out a number there and there's a different perspective there. So I'm going to try something on Zoom by sharing a video. So I'll let you watch this video. There's no sound needed. Just watch it and hopefully you can all see it. Sound is unnecessary in this one. Right? One of the very important skills that we need to possess in order to make difficult conversations go not so difficult is to park the judgment. The fundamental philosophy that none of us have sole possession of the truth. So what I mean by that, we need to bring 3 core skills into a conversation. And in the book, Difficult Conversations, we talk about the concepts of inquiry, acknowledgement, and advocacy. If you start a conversation with advocacy, explaining how you understand something, you are genuinely going to start with making the conversation difficult, because everyone will have a different understanding. We say we need to balance a conversation with these 3 skills. The ability to inquire, the ability to acknowledge, and the ability to advocate. Now, most of us in this room, we possibly don't need any more training on advocacy skills. We've gotten to be successful where we are from becoming reasonably good explaining our understanding, especially if any of us started our career in sales. You know, we learn the pitch, we want to give our presentation. I would often say that we learn later on that you might first want to ask, what is it they need? How is it they see their perspective? And acknowledgement is the bridge between inquiry and advocacy. And the core foundation is at the bottom. We call it the listening. Inquire only if you're interested in the answer, not to prove. So for example, a terrible conversation on performance appraisal could look like, so can you just share very quickly how your performance has been in the last 6 months? You know, boss, it's been a very difficult 6 months. There's a couple of challenges I've had. Exactly. Let me talk to you about these challenges. That project you were working on, boom, 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 and you just jumped right into the advocacy piece. Right? So you were inquiring only to collect that selective information you were looking for. So you might want to spend more time. So the skill that we kind of often talk about is, and if you're familiar with the Ladder of Inference from Chris Argyris and Sean, where they talk about that all of us have a ladder. We have certain conclusions we reach based on our interpretation and looking at the data. So giving you an example, look at that F exercise we did. All of you saw the same slide, but most of you, or there were a nice variation of responses from 9 to 15 to 16. because you were figuring out your interpretation was speeding up, reading, selective perception. And you reached a conclusion, which was the answer you gave. Now, I'd never told you, I think there was one person who said, I think the E's may also have an F. If you were thinking that, you could have actually asked me a question. So do you want us to look at the letter F or the shape Fs that show up everywhere else? You could, for example, inquire a bit more to understand what data and what interpretation am I going to be looking for. So one of the skills that we require very often is a lot of inquiry skills. Now, for those of you who use coaching in your organization, coaching is built on inquiry, whether it's appreciative inquiry or any form of open-ended questions to go down the ladder of your coachee. If you're a manager, why is it that we don't bring these coaching skills or these skills that we learn in the context of coaching to all conversations, whatever challenges they may be? So it's important to be able to look at it from that perspective. So it's really about bringing the ladder alive from that perspective and having that conversation. So I'll just pause here and maybe ask a couple of people to share the comments. Where have you seen conclusion and interpretation, the gap show up? Anybody who's got an example? So I'll just pick a couple of people random on voice. Pankaj Tiwari, I don't know, you're on mute. Would you like to share an example? If you want to go off mute. Where have you seen people having different conclusion conversations and then you discover you were working with different data to begin with? Pankaj, are you there? If not, I can jump to someone else. Anchit, would you want to share?
Sure. Vinay, maybe I'll need a minute to think of an example because this is a bit tricky.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll give you a minute. Lini, Jos, you mentioned something, performance discussions where you've seen that happen. Would you want to share? Just go off mute.
Yeah, so when you're having performance discussions, you normally have data of the person's performance, right? And then you'll discuss like how well, always I do the sandwich approach, discuss the best that they have done. And if I have to give any other feedback, I wedge it in and then close it off saying how well they did. But the point is when you tell them what they didn't do well, and if you don't have those kind of inquiry questions, it may turn out that your perspective is so different from what the other person has to say because the sides of the story are different.
Yeah.
And then that's when it falls on you to say that you only looked at one side of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you didn't give me a chance to speak. You are the one who just gave me all your data, right? Yeah. Great.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Vinay,
Yes.
Vinay, my thoughts, just circling back, in a typical scenario of handling employee relation issues. Let's say you have to take a disciplinary action on something about something, but in order to do that, in order to achieve that, you need to have a lot of data, a lot of interpretations, and a lot of evidence with you, and you also need to convey those interpretations to the other person. So that's where, this middle part of the layer, my interpretations and their interpretations, my data and their data, that's where in this kind of scenario, it becomes very critical.
Yeah. So I'm going to throw out an interesting observation. And this is where you kind of said, my data and their data. One of the best practices in having these conversations is even before you throw out your data, you might want to ask them their data first, their interpretation first. Because when they share their interpretation first to you, you might discover that right away your interpretation may have been wrong to begin with. And you might say, you know what, I have completely a different perspective. And therefore, let's discuss more on what you just said. If you start with yours, you're taking almost an advocacy position. and you're putting that other person on a back foot. So good conversational, to shift difficult conversations, is to start with, so tell me a little bit more. That's why we said start with inquiry first.
Vinay, Sirish here.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, Vinay, I feel most of the time what we see people is an inquisitiveness to understand the situation, but somewhere in the conversations, people lose out, their understanding capability, willingness to understand. That's where the listening, plays an important, a critical role.
Absolutely.
And also, issue is that a response what they want to give, subconsciously the responses are getting built up while they were also having these conversations. If that takes over during a conversation, your capacity to listen and understand before completely before answering to any of the other person, I think that is a critical part in a conversations, and difficult conversations will definitely have greater impact in that case.
Yeah, absolutely spot on, because you're really not listening. You're listening selectively only for information that validates the messaging you had prepared in your head to share while the other person was speaking, right?
It's controlling those thoughts is very critical. That's what.
Absolutely, and that's why we say that that is a learned skill for many of us, because the reality is we don't see the world through the other person's lens. We see it through our lens because that's the lens we grew up in, or that's the lens we have, and it becomes a truly. Now, a great example, and a couple of people on the call who know me, early on in my career when I was a student studying in the US, one of the jobs I had taken, and I don't say this lightly, it was the most stressful job I've ever done in my career. I was on a suicide hotline, answering. I was a counselor on a suicide hotline. People used to call in, and basically my job was to talk to them, understand them, and really, calm them down and essentially prevent them from going through with suicide. Now, I lasted only 8 months in that job, of which 2.5 months was training. And because, one of the most stressful, because at the back of your mind, there's 100 questions going, but you've got to be able to ask the right questions. You can't even say, when somebody gives you a reason why they're thinking of doing it, you can't say, what a stupid reason. Are you crazy? Right? What's wrong with you? You can't even say any of that. You just have to say, tell me more. Can you explain to me what happened there? Why? And that is a skill that, fortunately or unfortunately, I learned very early on in my career. And I had forgotten it along the way. And we pick it up again because we go back to our way of pitching our view. And this is absolutely, as many of you said, the number one skill that we need to sort of do, bring back into the workplace. So start with the ladder inquiry. So the shift that I talked about is to move from a difficult conversation to a learning conversation. It's almost what you just said, Krish. If you say it's going to be difficult, you've already gone into that meeting with a mindset, oh my God, what's going to happen? Let me get my data ready to convince the other person. But if I say I'm going to go in just to learn, so let me just tell you what the shifts look like. A difficult conversation is and I'm sure all of you have seen this. It argue about who's right and who's wrong. Classical symptom. Blame and seek to avoid being blamed. Right? A difficult performance conversation usually sits on the left side here. And it assumes intent from impact. It just moves into an accusing mode. But a learning conversation says, what are the different perceptions? How both stories make sense? You're not saying that your story makes more sense than the others. That's why I always say, start with understanding their story first. It'll literally open you up.
So, Vinay, I have a question.
Yes.
So typically in a difficult conversations, before we identify that we are into a difficult conversation, what role the fear plays? Because like you said, if we are going for a difficult conversation and we know that we are going to have this conversation, we are getting prepared and there are a lot of answers or maybe our arrows are ready. But then when we don't know that we are getting into difficult conversation, and suddenly you identify yourself, and there is a fear that comes in, what's going to happen or how this is going to be. Any such experiences, anything, such kind of things would really help if you could, what one needs to do and how that needs to be handled.
Yeah, most people, they know they're going into a difficult conversation even before they go in, because they've created the difficult in their mind, the concept of difficulty. So the first thing is, it might be difficult, but I'm going to go in and just ask a lot of questions to understand the other person's perspective, right? So I can give you an example. Early on, when I was a frontline supervisor, one of the first things I had to do was lay off 25% of my team in one of the global crises in those days. And I had massive anxiety. And I remember my mentor telling me, he said, look, everyone reads the news. Just go and have a quick conversation. My first 2 conversations went very bad. My third one, I said, it's going to go the way it does. Let me just go and ask the person, how's it going? What's happening? What's the news you're
Vinay,
hearing?
can you speak from near the mic? So I'm not.
Sure. Can you hear me now? Is this better?
Yeah, it's better. It's better.
Okay. So in that conversation, I just went into a lot of questions, and that employee looked at me and said, Vinay, I know why we are having this conversation. I know you're in a difficult spot, and I'm assuming you're having this conversation with me to cut me from the team. And I just took a deep breath and I said, yes. And okay, so what do we do about it? How can we make? So I said, my job is to help make this easier for you. So it changed the conversation to what do we do next there. But I remember learning from that. It started with me asking a lot of questions. What does he know? What's he hearing? What is his perception of how the team is doing, the organization is doing, etc. So I think it's the joint contribution there. And in my head, I just had to, by the way, I'm giving you the ideal one. The first 2 conversations were a disaster, right? Because I went in with, here's a tough situation. I spoke for the first 10 minutes. In the third conversation, he spoke for the first 10 minutes. Made a big difference. So what happened? So that's one piece. The second piece is also feelings, is the question that was just asked. Avoid feelings or express them poorly is a sign of difficult conversation. When you walk in and say, you know what, we're going to have a tough conversation. I'm sorry to say this. This conversation is going to give me a lot of is giving me anxiety, and I don't know how you're feeling about it, but I'm hoping that we can both manage our feelings better by the end of it. And that was my third conversation, by the way. And he asked me, boss, why are you feeling so anxious? What happened? And I said, what are you hearing in the team? What are you hearing? That's when he said, yeah, I think you're telling me about layoffs, right? Yeah, I get it. So don't be so anxious. So here's a guy who was laying off who's calming me down as his manager, than me trying to calm him down. And I remember it was really about bringing the feelings up. And the third is identity. A difficult conversation is an identity conversation. Get knocked off balance by shock. It could be ego. It could be so many different things. And there, one of the skills is the ability to regain your balance and talk about it and say, look, this is not about it's not about customer and supplier relationship. It is not, it is about 2 professionals having a conversation on something that needs to go. And not even being able to take attacks personally when you recognize that it's not. So easier said than done. All of you are thinking, yeah, I recognize everything that's written around the word difficult. On the right side, it's all idealistic, utopian, great. And that's where we say it comes back to skill. So difficult conversation is not, it's a feeling, but it has to translate into skills. I was with a group yesterday on a call, and one of them said, the more crisis and difficult situations we've had in our career, we learn the skill of moving towards a learning conversation, right? So it is something that we learn through experience, but we can also learn through observation, practice, and being mentored. It doesn't have to be always through experience. You can learn through experience of others. So why is this critical? The bottom line, right? This is simple. In today's world, if you can transform difficult conversations into learning conversations, the reality is you can you improve results, decision making, learning, strategy, and you get better relationship management. And at the bottom, I have highlighted something which is the words that everybody is talking about today. Everyone's talking about mental health. Everyone's talking about anxiety, employee anxiety in all organizations in the latest crisis. So with that, the ability to transform difficult conversations into learning conversations actually helps people, you firstly, and others get less anxious, and it promotes better mental health all around as well. So I've tried to give you what is called, typically what we do in difficult conversations is do a 1 to 2 day course in it, where we have practice, feedback, situations, etc. But I've just tried to give you the concept here to understand that this is a personal opinion of mine, my point of view, and you can agree or disagree. The current crisis that many of us are facing, and I've been through global financial crisis and so many others, this is significant. And one thing I've realized at the end of all of these crises, the number of conversations we have that are perceived to be difficult tend to increase. I don't know if you agree with me or not, because of business impact, personal impact, social impact. This time around, it's across the board. I had a very, very difficult conversation yesterday evening in my apartment complex in my society, because I'm on the association, and there is a couple that wore gloves and masks, and for the last 2 days have been throwing it when they come back home into the staircase. Right. So today morning's news made it easier for me to have that conversation, because I think the government's passed a new rule that says they must be disposed of. But yesterday evening I had to knock on their door, and I had to say, "I'm sorry, sir, I just want to check with you, your gloves and masks, where are you disposing them?" He said, "I've thrown it in the corridor." And I wanted to say, "Are you crazy?" My mind was telling me, "Are you mad?" But I had to say, I had to switch that to a learning conversation. I just want to understand from you, sir, what was your intention of putting it in the corridor? And he said, no, I have a small kid at home and I don't want to bring, these used gloves and all of that. I said, okay, great. So what's another way we can manage it? Because housekeeping has to pick it up in hand. So he said, oh, yeah, you're right. So, but I was knocking on the door and everyone told me that this guy is a very painful guy. So I had expected it to be a very difficult conversation, but it wasn't so, right? And so it was funny because I was remembering that this morning, saying I'll use that as an example in the session. But I think it's critical there, right? Okay, so I've given you a little bit, and I know, so at C2C, we're now transforming a lot of these sessions into virtual sessions. So even difficult conversations, we can do it from a virtual role plays, etc. So we are there to support you in all of that. But I'm going to stop now and throw it up to any Q&A. Any questions, thoughts around DIFCON that you want to ask? We've got 5 minutes. You can put it in chat, or you can go off mute and ask a question.
Hi, Vinay, this is Ravi here.
Yes,
one
Ravi.
question which is I'm struggling with. Many a times in the difficult conversation, we end up with a very emotional outburst or an anger response,
right?
Which is sometimes even the threatening response. So are there any tips you want to share with group?
So the one thing I learned, and this is I learned from my early days, when someone's upset, you say, okay, so Ravi, I can sense you're getting really, really angry right now and you're very upset. So a couple of thoughts. One is, I'd love to hear why you're so upset. The other is, could we take a quick break and maybe continue in 5 minutes after you've come down a little bit? But I really want to make sure that we are able to manage your, I would not want to get you so upset. That's what I would do. Call it out. Worst thing you could ever do is, Ravi, I don't see any reason for you to get upset. Yeah, come on, don't take it so personal. 90% of the time, that person will get even more angry.
Yeah.
So sometimes just acknowledge, as it says, acknowledge it, I'm not saying, you shouldn't say, I agree with you why you're upset. And if I was in your shoes, I'd also be upset. I mean, that's not going to help you. But just acknowledge their feelings and share, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Mr. Vinay, Ramesh here.
Yes.
Taking on what you said in the parlance of emotional intelligence, they call it by the term VET, V-E-T. You validate with the individual his emotions, explore further, and try to transform that emotions into a positive one for him.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
I think it's much easier said than really
easier said than done. Yes.
So the skill has to be picked up.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a question in chat. I'll just read it out from Anshit. What's the key differentiator in handling tough conversations with an employee or customer vis-a-vis a family member or a friend? Oh, great one. Yeah, the conversations at home typically have a higher relational and feeling perspective involved, and you can't tell in a home setting to either your spouse, parent, sibling, child, let's be professional about it, right? Whereas in the workplace, there is this concept of decorum, etc., that play a role so the bigger one I think it has a stronger perspective of inquiry and acknowledgement in a family context. I don't know if that makes sense, Anshit, sorry. No. Anybody else? Any other final questions? So hopefully it's got you thinking, and like all of you said, easier said than done. I think it becomes very, very important. There's another question. Let me just take the last one for the benefit of everybody. I have some disagreement with X. Y is senior to both of us. Y believes in X. I know that whatever I discuss with Y will not be empathized. How to start conversation and carry on. Yeah, if you got a disagreement with X and Y is involved, you might want to just start with, look, there has to be some validity in what X has said. That person, it can't be completely, there must be some data interpretation or conclusion that is valid. You may be disagreeing on some elements of it. So you want to start with the positive. There's a couple of things that X has said that there, where I disagree with, and I'd love to get your inputs, might be even one as well. How would you have responded if your neighbor would have said that, that they had been properly disposed, lied? Well, good question, but we had actually caught it on camera. That's how we knew it was them. So I wouldn't have said, you know, we know that was dropped off. So somebody had actually seen them dropping it off. Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. And I want to be conscious of time. We had committed to finish at 4. It is exactly 3:59. So thank you very much. Feel free to drop an email to me. My email ID is vinay@c2c-od.com, and then happy to hear from you as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Vinay. It was a nice session. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you, Vinay.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you, Vinay.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you and bye.
Bye. Bye. Have a good.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah. I'll stick around if anybody has any questions.
Thanks, Vinay. Bye.
Bye.